chat and Q&A, and if you are in the room, by simply raising your hand. This year, we're very pleased to be offering simultaneous translation into Spanish for all the streamed sessions. If you'd like to access that, if you would like to access the translation, please visit our conference website for details. And if you are here in the room, please go to the registration desk because there are headsets there. With that, I shall hand over to Clive Bates, who will be hosting your first keynote session. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Good morning, everyone. Anyone got a head like a sphinx this morning, just by any chance? Yeah? Right, we have a real treat in store for you this morning. I was lucky enough to watch this session earlier just to get up to speed on it. But we have the great Marc Gunther, who can't be with us in person, and he'll explain why. It's a sad story. But has recorded his keynote presentation, which takes a hard look, and I mean a hard look, at the role that foundations play in the politics, policy, and science of tobacco harm reduction. And it's a brilliant oration, I have to say. Once we're done with Marc, and we've got some voting to do in the middle. Once we're done with Marc, we're going to pass to Fiona Patten, who is going to give a response to that, maybe giving us a bit of the political angle. Then we're going to go into question and answers. So I want you all to think of your questions and answers. I'll chip in a few. We're going to get some online, hopefully. They'll flash up in front of me. And then we'll get a good discussion going for the rest of the session. So we've got plenty of time. So without further ado, my signal to the mission control over there is we are good to go on the video. Let's go with the video and start listening to Marc Gunther. Thanks very much, everyone.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm sorry I can't be joining you in person. I was looking forward to meeting many of you, but my wife's 96-year-old mother has just died, so I needed to stay home this week. If anyone had told me just 2 years ago that I was about to write many thousands of words about e-cigarettes and be invited to speak at a conference about nicotine, I definitely would not have believed it. I hadn't smoked since college. Well, at least I hadn't smoked tobacco. I had never even tried an e-cigarette. I'm still not sure that I could pick a Puff Bar or a Vuse out of a lineup of e-cigarettes. So what led me here? I'm going to try to explain. I've been a reporter for a long time. Not quite 50 years, but getting there. I've written newspaper stories, magazine articles, and books on a range of topics: politics, government, sports, business, the environment. And in 2015, I turned my attention to the world of philanthropy and began contributing regularly to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, a US publication that covers foundations and nonprofits. I had a lot of personal connections to the world of foundations and nonprofits. My wife, my brother, and my oldest daughter all worked for nonprofits or advocacy groups. And it struck me as a sector that needed more journalistic scrutiny. I'd spent the prior 20 years as a business reporter, and it was obvious to me that foundations and nonprofits utterly lacked the feedback loops that, at least in theory, work to hold businesses and even governments accountable. We all know how it works in business. Companies need customers if they want to survive and thrive. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Apple or Altria or the restaurant on the corner. If a company can produce a product or a service at a price that people are willing to pay, it stands a good chance of success. Particularly in competitive markets, companies that produce the most appealing products or services will thrive. Those that do not please their customers will fail. It's far from a perfect system, as we all know, but it's the best we have, and importantly, it's dynamic. The Fortune 500 list of the US's biggest corporations is constantly churning as new companies grow and old ones fade away. By contrast, in the world of nonprofits and foundations, the feedback loops don't operate well. It's bad enough with nonprofits. A local food bank feeds the poor, but it is funded mostly by well-to-do donors. The quality of its food or service may be just fine or not so good, but its success depends on winning over those donors, not on satisfying those who it feeds. Advocacy groups like Greenpeace or Amnesty International or the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids may set out to serve the environment or the cause of human rights or the health of kids, but they too are beholden not to their causes, but to their donors. And it's often very hard, all but impossible really, to know whether they're effective in their work. If that sounds bad, it's much worse with foundations, especially large endowed foundations. At least nonprofit groups have to explain themselves to donors. Foundations are accountable to no one. Let me repeat that. Foundations are accountable to no one. There is nothing that resembles a market for foundations. There's no competitive pressure on them to improve their performance. New money comes along all the time, but many of the biggest foundations in the US, Ford, the Lilly Endowment, Robert Wood Johnson, Kellogg, Rockefeller, these all date back to the 1930s or earlier. They are never going to go out of business unless they choose to spend down their endowments. Meantime, foundations enjoy generous government benefits. Their endowments are not taxed. They own high-priced real estate in New York or Silicon Valley, and they are exempt from property taxes. They are regulated so lightly that the rules governing them are all but meaningless. Although they can't spend money directly on political campaigns, they can and do exercise political power by educating, and put that in quotes, elected officials and the general public. All of this raises a question. How should we think about foundations, or philanthropy rather, as it's practiced by big foundations and billionaire donors? Historically, my sense is that we've usually responded with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Millionaire or Mr. Billionaire, for that new wing at the hospital or that new building on campus. But in recent years, this has begun to change. We're starting to see more critical thinking in academia and more critical reporting in the press about large-scale philanthropy. In a book called Just Giving, a political scientist named Rob Reich, who teaches at Stanford, makes the case that we need to think differently about large-scale charitable giving. He writes, philanthropy, especially big philanthropy, is an exercise of power. Any exercise of power deserves our scrutiny, not our gratitude. It deserves rigorous attention. That's the approach I have tried to take in my own reporting for the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which brings me to the story of Bloomberg Philanthropies. Bloomberg Philanthropies was founded in 2006. It's one of the newer foundations that we have. Unlike, say, Ford or Rockefeller, it is guided by a living donor, Michael Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg is best known because he served 3 terms as mayor of New York City, and in many respects, he was a successful mayor. He also ran for president, very briefly, in 2020. Mike Bloomberg made his fortune by starting a company that collects and sells financial data to Wall Street. He makes a big deal about how he is data-driven, and we'll get to that in a moment. But there's no doubt that the data business has been very good to him. He is worth an astonishing $82 billion, according to the Forbes list of billionaires. That is up from about $27 billion a decade ago. He has given away more than $12 billion, but like many billionaires, his wealth is increasing faster than he can push money out the door. Bloomberg has given across a broad array of causes. In education, he's currently funding charter schools, an alternative to public schools in the US. He has backed efforts to help low-income and African-American students attend college or medical school. On climate change, he supported a big Sierra Club campaign to shut down coal-burning power plants. In the public health arena, he has funded programs to curb communicable diseases, promote healthy eating and reduce obesity, improve road safety, protect abortion rights, and of course, reduce the use of tobacco and e-cigarettes. Much of this unfolds on a global scale. The Tobacco Initiative, for instance, covers 112 countries with a focus on the world's largest smoking populations, including in China, India, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. The foundation supports nonprofits that work with national and local government to take on such measures as prohibiting smoking in indoor public places, enforcing bans on tobacco advertising, and raising tobacco taxes. Here, I'd like to pause for just a moment and take an informal poll. 3 choices. 1, you support Bloomberg-funded campaigns around the world to reduce deaths from cigarette smoking. 2, you oppose the work he's done to curb smoking. And again, we're talking about smoking here, not vaping. And 3, you're not sure or you have mixed feelings. The idea here is to see whether you believe there is anything wrong in principle with billionaires using their philanthropic power to influence others. So I'm actually going to pause for a moment here, and I am going to ask Clive to take the poll as I read the choices, and I'll be back in just a moment. So again, number 1, raise your hands if you support Bloomberg-funded campaigns to reduce deaths from smoking.
Listen to him.
2, you oppose the work he's done around smoking. 3, you're not sure or you have mixed feelings.
Cut. Right. Okay. Now, I listened to that this morning and I was thinking, oh my God, that is a surprisingly difficult question to address, okay? So the way I read this, and I think he said this fairly clearly, you are being, even if you think Bloomberg is doing something unambiguously good, and you might not think that about smoking, but just let's imagine that. Is it still right that he does it and is influential on doing that because he is essentially he's doing this through a foundation with very little accountability? So that's what you're being asked to test here. Results versus the method, okay? Now, coming back to this, his first answer is, yes, I want to get the results. I want them to work on reducing smoking. Second is, no, essentially this is the wrong way of doing things. And then third, I'm not sure, it's too difficult, okay? So, does anybody want to first say a word about this question? Does anyone have a thought on this question before we go on? Or should we get straight to voting? Hang on a minute, I'm looking. Couple down there. Okay, let's just really quick statements because we've got the second half of his presentation. So quick interventions from the floor, please. Go, say who you are as well.
Nancy Lucas from CAFRA. When he read that question, the first thing, the alarm bells went off in my head. Just because you have money and power doesn't mean you should determine how other people live their lives.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone in favor of the results, no matter how they're achieved? Who's going to speak for that? I'm a little bit in that camp. People spend some money, do some good things. What's wrong with that? That's what whole charity is.
I think it really depends where you sit. Okay, because if you are a person who is benefiting for a scholarship and you'd never get that otherwise, you might think differently. because I believe that everybody's biased.
Yeah.
So we are here, and we are affected by his decision in one way. But some other people that perhaps get the help that they need and you not get otherwise might think differently. So I think this is a very complex question, because everybody's biased.
Okay. Anybody else want to just chip in? Just say who you are as well, if you don't mind.
Hi, David Sweener. I'll counter Nancy and say, we all have the ability to do good things in our lives, and if that's something like you're a very good surgeon, you do surgery. If you happen to have billions of dollars and you think you can make the world a better place, terrific. So, you know, isn't that a good thing to do with your life if you possibly can?
So I should point out that David Sweener is conflicted here because he is a philanthropist. Okay. Gives away money. Okay, anybody else? Quick, Jonathan, John Fell, down here. Run. There he is. Thanks, John.
Hi, I mean, I guess my initial reaction is surprise that the question's being asked, because we're conditioned not to think about this, just to assume that if someone's giving money away, we should be grateful for it.
Yeah. No, it is a surprising question, but when you think about it, there's actually a lot of depth to it. Okay. Any final, one last comment, if anyone's got one, and then we'll take the big poll, having aired a few views. Yep. Say your name.
Yeah, Rafi Casillo from the Philippines. I think it's difficult to answer the first question, or the question, because actually it involves both the end and the means of Bloomberg. We may agree with the end, the objective, the main aim, but we may not agree with the means. So it's really difficult to answer it as one single question. It has to be divided into two separate questions, okay. Actually.
Vote not sure.
Okay.
In that case. All right, folks. Oh, so do you want a quick one there, and then we really will go to the vote.
Martin Colley from Scotland, working for a cancer charity, we rely greatly on philanthropic income, and I see the good that does, and that would very much influence my thoughts on the use of that money. So I think the end in that respect justifies the means.
Okay. John?
Hi.
Name?
My name's John Summers. I'm from the UK. I volunteer with a number of charities in a lot of different sectors. And part of the work that I do as a volunteer is actually keeping the philanthropists in check, of actually having to say to them, yeah, you can help, but you need to give the people that you're helping agency and actually allow them to make the decisions. It's fine for you to use your money to enable them, but you can't force people.
Right. I think we're edging to... Right, I keep saying one more. Last one there, go on. So is that Michelle? I can't see, I'm just blinded by the light. If you could just, it's a good point though. I think we're on to a progress in the argument with that.
Hi, Michelle Minton, Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'll very quickly say, and I think this is something a lot of people may not think of. There can be good things you can do with philanthropy, and I'm someone who benefits. I work at a nonprofit from this. However, sometimes even if, you can give $1 billion and end smoking, the other results may not be very good for the world, right? If you undermine civil society in other countries, if you destroy the ability for individuals in that country to participate in their democratic process, is that worth ending smoking? I don't know, but I think that's one of the questions we have to think about.
All right, I am going to go to the vote now. Okay, so the first one, going back to Mark's question, Bloomberg spending big on reducing smoking around the world. Yes, you're in favour of that. Hands up. Okay, a smattering there, smattering. Smoking, not vaping, remember. We're talking about dealing with smoking. It's probably about 7 or something in the audience. Okay, Bloomberg, you're opposed to Bloomberg spending money on dealing with smoking around the world. He shouldn't do it. Okay. Many more, but not overwhelming. Probably, what, 20, would you say? 20? Okay. You're not sure, or brackets, it's complicated. Yeah. That one wins. That one wins. Okay, great. Well, that's really interesting. I think that's a quite thought-provoking triad of questions there. My own sense on this is really it depends. If there was more robust governance and accountability, which there isn't in Bloomberg's case, then, and there's much more connection with the at-risk population, there's much better awareness of unintended consequences. If the money is flowing with better governance, then maybe. But as things stand at the moment, I'm very much in the opposed camp. So there you are, there's my biases disclosed. Okay, Mission Control, we're ready. Second part of Marc's talk.
Okay, so let's get on to e-cigarettes. Late in 2020, I was interviewing Ethan Nadelman, the founder and longtime executive director of an advocacy group called the Drug Policy Alliance. We were talking about an entirely different story, and he suggested that I look into Bloomberg's work on vaping. I was intrigued, but I have to say, I had no idea what I was getting into. As many of you know, Bloomberg Philanthropies announced in the fall of 2019 that along with the campaign for tobacco-free kids, it was beginning a $160 million three-year campaign to end what they described as an epidemic of e-cigarette use among kids. Over the course of the next few months, I researched a story about Bloomberg and e-cigarettes for the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I had several things going for me. First, because I knew nothing about the topic, I came to it with an open mind. Second, I had plenty of time to do research. And third, I had lots of space to publish what I learned. I was more than a little surprised to find that the organizations supported by Bloomberg, as well as the man himself, again, who proudly talks about being data-driven, were saying many things that turned out not to be true. Bloomberg wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times, quote, "All the progress we've made in reducing teen smoking is being turned around," unquote. Wrong. Teen smoking rates were falling, and they have continued to fall. During an appearance on CBS News, Bloomberg said, quote, "Just think if your kid was doing this," meaning vaping, "and winds up with an IQ 10 or 15 points lower than he or she would have had for the rest of her life," unquote. That's wrong again. No reputable scientist believes that the nicotine in e-cigarettes, or in cigarettes for that matter, causes a long-term decline in IQ. Other claims by the opponents of vaping turned out to be false as well. No, vaping does not appear to be a gateway to smoking. No, vaping is not, as they claim, ineffective as a smoking cessation tool. And no, vaping is not comparable to smoking in terms of its impact on human health. As I did my research, there were two moments for me when, as the Brits like to say, the penny dropped, meaning that I came to an understanding that I had not had before. The first came when I read an essay in the journal Science that struck me as a rebuke to Bloomberg and the campaign for tobacco-free kids. The authors were Amy Fairchild, Cheryl Helton, David Abrams, Jim Curran, and Ronald Bayer, who are all deans of schools of public health and/or people who had devoted their lives to tobacco control. They warned against prohibitionist measures and argued that it was a mistake to restrict access to vaping products while leaving lethal cigarettes on the market. Stephen Schroeder, the former president of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, was another important voice in the story. He lives in San Francisco, where thanks to a ban on e-cigarettes pushed by Bloomberg and tobacco-free kids, you can now buy cigarettes on any corner, you can buy marijuana in licensed dispensaries, but you can't buy vapes. That doesn't make any sense. The second aha moment came when I asked the people at the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids to point me to scientists who supported their efforts to get flavored e-cigarettes off the market. They sent me to Stan Glantz. That was telling. His 2019 study alleging that vaping doubled the rate of heart attacks had to be retracted when it turned out that some of the heart attacks took place before people had started to vape. I dug a little deeper into his work on both cigarettes and e-cigarettes, and it didn't take me long to learn that Professor Glantz is an ideologue who has allowed his hatred for all things tobacco to distort his science. Here's the problem, though. Despite the bad science, despite the misleading claims put forth by Bloomberg and Tobacco-Free Kids and the Center for Disease Control and others, and largely because of the confusion created by these opponents around the disease that has been misnamed EVALI, the anti-vaping campaigns have been effective. The work of Bloomberg-funded groups and others, including the Truth Initiative, has helped persuade elected officials in 4 states, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, to ban flavored e-cigarettes. California voters will have to decide this November whether to ban flavored cigarettes and e-cigarettes. About 50 cities and counties have done so as well, including Washington, D.C., Chicago, and most recently, Los Angeles. Federal law was enacted that prohibits selling vapes through the mail, which creates a burden on consumers who live in rural areas. This was an unusual story for me and for the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Big foundations frequently spend a lot of money and don't accomplish much. They've poured billions into the issue of climate change, for example, and they have little to show for it. But it is much less common for a big foundation to spend a lot of money, make progress towards its goals, and wind up doing more harm than good. In my opinion, at least, that's the story here. So, if the anti-vaping campaign was not guided by science, you have to wonder, what explains the decision by Bloomberg and Matt Myers of Tobacco-Free Kids to take such a hard line against e-cigarettes? Clive, as usual, puts the question well. He wrote on his blog, why would it make sense to ban the much safer nicotine product, deliberately deny law-abiding smokers better options, protect the cigarette trade from competition, and stimulate unregulated black markets? I didn't have a clear answer to that question then, and I'm afraid I don't have one now. I could speculate that Bloomberg has always been a bit of a scold. You may remember that as New York mayor, he got the city to ban supersized sodas until that regulation was overturned by the courts. I could speculate that Matt Myers, having largely succeeded in curbing smoking by teens, needed a new target to justify the continued existence of the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. Its most recent tax return shows it employs 120 people and has an annual budget of $41 million. It's also possible that the activists who oppose vaping, like Professor Glantz, have such a visceral hatred for the tobacco industry and a predisposition to believe that they have to oppose anything that the industry does. Finally, I must agree with Ken Warner of the University of Michigan that questions of social class come into play. As best as we can tell, many teen vapers come from good, and I'll put that in quotes, good families, well-to-do families in Manhattan and Silicon Valley. By contrast, smokers tend to come from lower socioeconomic groups, marginalized groups, and they have become mostly invisible to those of us who are well-educated and comfortable, and as a result, they elicit little sympathy. Okay, although my story for the Chronicle was very long, it focused entirely on the US. It didn't get into Bloomberg's global work, which is extensive. Once again, Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids is a key partner, as are other nonprofit groups, all of whom, as best as I can tell, oppose both combustible cigarettes and e-cigarettes around the world. Just to run down a few of those. There is Vital Strategies, a big nonprofit health consultancy based in Washington that publishes the Tobacco Atlas. Vital Strategies got $23 million for its tobacco work from Bloomberg in 2019, according to the foundation's most recent tax return. I should note here that one of the many problems with holding foundations accountable is that they are ridiculously slow to file their taxes and disclose their grants, and that's one of the very few things they're required to do under US law. There is the Union, a global NGO based in Paris, which just a few weeks ago published a position paper calling for a ban on all e-cigarettes in low and middle income countries. About 80% of the world's smokers live in these low and moderate income countries. Bloomberg also funds global tobacco control work at universities, including Johns Hopkins, his alma mater, and at the University of Bath in England, which is home to an industry watchdog group called STOP. It stands for Stopping Tobacco Organizations and Products. This reflects that rather mindless belief that anything the tobacco companies are doing needs to be stopped. I could go on and on. Bloomberg funds a media collaborative called the Investigative Desk based in the Netherlands, which takes a hardline position against e-cigarettes. With the Gates Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies supported tobacco control programs at the World Bank, which offers policy advice and technical assistance to governments, again, in those low and moderate income countries. And most damaging of all, I'd guess, is the relationship between Bloomberg and the World Health Organization. The WHO obviously holds Mike Bloomberg in high esteem. He has been given the title of Global Ambassador for Non-Communicable Diseases. He has in turn generously funded the WHO with many millions of dollars for a variety of projects, including $5 million for its tobacco work, again in 2019. There's a lot we could say about the WHO. Its messaging around e-cigarettes is one-sided, misleading, and harmful, as Clive recently pointed out at some length on his blog. It's frankly stunning to me how the WHO manages to confuse people about questions that should be settled by now. The fact that e-cigarettes are less dangerous than cigarettes, the fact that they had nothing to do with e-volley, the fact that vaping can help people who want to quit smoking. Arguably, the WHO goes even further than Bloomberg, calling for bans on all electronic cigarettes. Last year, the organization gave its highest award to Dr. Harsh Pardhan, India's health minister, for leading the way as India banned e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. This in a country where about 30% of adults use tobacco products and an estimated 1.2 million people die from tobacco-related diseases every year. About 35 to 40 countries now ban e-cigarettes, including India, Brazil, Argentina, and most recently Mexico. How much of the credit or blame for that belongs to Bloomberg and his allies is hard to say. It would take a team of researchers a long time to track his influence country by country, but there is no doubt that it's vast. Michelle Minton of the Competitive Enterprise Institute has done great work on this, tracking Bloomberg's work in places like the Philippines and Vietnam. So I would refer you to her work if you want to know more. Let me wrap up by returning to the question of accountability. Bloomberg Philanthropies is, in theory, governed by a board of directors. There are 24 members, most of them at the end of distinguished careers. The former U.S. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, former U.S. Senator Sam Nunn, and former CEOs of big companies, including Bob Iger of Disney, John Mack of Morgan Stanley, Sir Martin Sorrell of WPP, Sam Palmisano of IBM, Ken Chenault of American Express. None are really experts in public health or climate change or education, but They are each paid a modest $10,500 a year for their services. And unfortunately, it's essentially impossible for an outsider to know what oversight, if any, they exercise. That's the board. What we do know is that Mike Bloomberg and the paid staff of the foundation have demonstrated by their actions that they are unwilling to question the assumptions behind their e-cigarette work or better understand the effect of what they're doing. After my story ran in the Chronicle last year, a dozen or so public health experts wrote to Bloomberg and asked for a meeting. They included Steve Schroeder, formerly at Robert Wood Johnson, Cheryl Helton, founding president of Truth Initiative, and other folks with impeccable credentials, including Cliff Douglas, Ken Warner, Mike Cummings, etc. They got nowhere. Even after providing extensive documentation, they could not even get a meeting. That, to me, is troubling. As Cliff Douglas told me, all we wish to do is provide information and insight and explore key questions, the answers to which will affect the lives and well-being of millions of people. What's the downside to that? A very good question. To wrap up and move into questions, I'm tempted now to quote Woody Allen, who at the end of one of his stand-up routines said, "I would like to leave you on a positive note. Would you take 2 negatives instead?" But unlike Woody, I am going to try to conclude on a positive note. I can't be sure, but I'm starting to think that the anti-vaping movement has peaked. The so-called vaping epidemic among teenagers is clearly over. 2 years have passed since the Avali scare. Globally, the number of countries that have enacted prohibitions on vaping has actually fallen in the last couple of years. And recently in the US, the state of Colorado rejected a vaping ban. It's worth noting, too, that Bloomberg's 3-year, $160 million commitment to the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids winds down this September. Will it be renewed or extended? I have no idea, but the science continues to make clear that vaping is a safer alternative to smoking and, for many adults, a way to end the smoking habit. The issue is complicated and hard to explain, as you all know, but I don't think it's too hard to reach an evidence-driven policy that balances the needs of adult smokers with the risks to kids. Make vapes available to adults, double down on efforts to keep them out of the hands of teenagers, and most importantly, tell the truth about the science. For many of you, I imagine it must be hard to fight what is a difficult battle against powerful forces. I've only been writing about this for close to 2 years now, and there are certainly days when I wonder why I have to say and write the same things over and over again. But I try to remember the words of a great American reporter, social critic, and contrarian named H.L. Mencken. Mencken said, "It's not worth an intelligent person's time to be in the majority. By definition, there are already enough people to do that." So, let's all of us please keep doing our best to seek out the truth and then to tell the truth. Thank you very much for listening.
Absolutely fantastic. I hope that's going to prompt a really good question and answer and discussion session. But for our first reaction, we're going to go to Fiona Patten, member of the Legislative Council of the Parliament of Victoria, brilliant politician, very articulate advocate. I'm going to hand over to her now. Fiona, what did you make of that?
Oh, it was terrific, and I think Mark hit the nail on the head, and I think it really kind of, I suppose I was somewhat surprised, probably because I don't live and breathe tobacco harm reduction, but how often we've been talking about Bloomberg over the last few days. I'm sure he'd be quite chuffed about that, you know, he's been on our minds and in our thoughts over this time. But I think Marc has really articulated a lot of the issues, again, that have been raised. Also, I think Lars yesterday, in his really splendid analysis of the effectiveness of Empower, or the lack thereof, it goes to what Matt was saying in his speech today. But the one thing that kept striking me about Bloomberg and about the way that Marc has presented this argument was the Catholic Church. I just couldn't get the Catholic Church out of my mind. Here was another huge enterprise that funded schools, didn't pay tax, put in very moral funding arrangements into developing countries. So, you know, we see developing countries not being able to have access to family planning because of funding from the Catholic Church. So I could see these real connections to it. Also, the fact that both of them are not accountable. Both of them spend billions and billions of dollars in areas where governments also spend money. And I think it's that overlap. And that concern, that, you know, I think that's where we see that lack of accountability. And it's, you know, when we look at charities or charitable status, or even the definition of charity, it's in the Tax Act. It's not in some other well-being piece of legislation, it's in the Tax Act. So people just say that they're doing have these goals. We never test whether they achieve those goals. Where we do, if it's a publicly funded organisation, we test whether publicly funded schools meet the goals of educating children. We test whether our public hospitals meet the goals of treating people and saving people's lives. We don't test that when it's foundations or not-for-profits such as, well, not Bloomberg's not really a not-for-profit, is it? I mean, you could almost question whether it's philanthropy or tax evasion. Bloomberg doesn't pay very much tax for a man who earns so much money. And that's because, you know, ostensibly he's putting that money into good things, much the same as the Catholic Church ostensibly has been doing only good things as well. The other thought I had was, weirdly, Harry Anslinger. I don't know if people know Harry Anslinger. He was the drug czar. First he led the kind of prohibition of alcohol. He led the policing of the prohibition of alcohol. When that failed, he was left with a big army of people who needed a job. So they moved over to cannabis. And started what we know as the war on drugs. And I couldn't help thinking of Matt Meyer in that same situation, where he'd managed to reduce smoking in children to such great levels that he needed something else to do to keep those people to keep the people that he employs employed. And I can't help making those connections. I think finally, one of the points that Marc didn't make and needs to be talked about is the amount of money that Bloomberg actually donates to politicians. So he is a very big donor of the Democrats. I think a lot of politicians in the United States would rate their electoral success on the donations that they had received from Mike Bloomberg. So I don't think there's a single door in the Capitol that is closed to this person. And I think that is when you really need to question the accountability and the need for greater transparency in organisations like Bloomberg, but I would also say organisations like the Catholic Church. But I'll leave my comments there, but I found it fascinating, and I ended up going down a whole bunch of rabbit holes this morning as a result of the things that were triggered by this really terrific speech.
Very good, Fiona. Thanks very much. An interesting parallel there between the Catholic Church and Bloomberg Philanthropies, both judged by the Almighty and accountable in the afterlife.
Bloomberg says that he won't be judged by the Almighty. He's got a clear free pass into heaven, I believe. I saw a quote from him this morning saying that he would not be interviewed by God. He'd be going straight through.
His catchphrase is, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data." And as Mark did a brilliant piece saying, "Bring data unless it's data we don't like."
Do as I say, not as I do.
Exactly. Great. Okay, I'm gonna pick up on a little bit on one of the questions, the second of the questions that's coming online. If you're watching online and remotely, don't forget, put your questions. They're going to arrive in front of me here, so you're going to have a place in the discussion. But what I'd like to ask, just to get the discussion started, I ask both of you. Fiona, you're part of a power structure that has democratic legitimacy. I mean, at least that's the theory. People vote for you, they elect you as a politician. What is the role of politics in terms of its interaction with this other center of power that is perhaps less accountable than we would like? What should politicians, how should they be, as Mark puts it, grateful? Oh, look, there's a new hospital wing, thank you. Or should they be like, hang on a minute, who put you in this position?
I'm really troubled by it, and I have been for quite some time. And again, I apologise for making the religious analogy here again, but we don't put the same level of accountability on organisations that don't pay tax. And organisations like Bloomberg or organisations like the church that don't pay tax, we don't put that accountability on them, and I'm very troubled by that. And in Australia, we have a very large Catholic school system. Now, we don't actually question the results that school system gets. In fact, we give them a bucket of money and say, go and spend it as you choose. So I'm increasingly troubled by the lack of accountability for not-for-profits and the growing reliance that governments are having on these organisations. And, frankly, I'd just like them to pay their tax, and then the governments could fund good healthcare, the governments could fund good education, the governments could fund good, harm reduction campaigns. So from a politician's perspective, I have been calling for greater scrutiny of these organisations and greater accountability of why they don't pay land tax, why, again, go back to the Catholic Church because it's the one I've looked at the most, but in Victoria, it is the largest landholder in Victoria with the exception of the state government, and it pays no land tax. And I'm increasingly troubled by that, and I think we do, if they're not going to pay tax, at least prove that they're doing what they say they're doing.
Yeah. Mark, first of all, this is to test the connection and the audio and mission control and everything over there. Have you got any thoughts on what the kind of interaction, you're quite eloquent on the fact that many foundations have very weak governance and accountability. The boards are non-specialized. There's no one else in the picture. There are no beneficiaries. There are no funders. What about government and ministers, either ministers or politicians, legislatures? How should they interact with powerful foundations? What sort of thing would you expect to see, and what are you seeing?
Good morning. I think that's a hard question, Clive, because unfortunately, at least in the US, the government agencies, particularly the CDC, have not covered themselves with glory on this issue of e-cigarettes. Now, more generally, like Fiona, I wonder whether we should continue to give foundations and nonprofits the kind of very favorable tax treatment that they're getting. The problem in the US is actually worse than I described in my talk, because more and more billionaire philanthropists are not even forming foundations, which at least are subject to some minimum rules around disclosure, distribution of their assets. They're simply setting up these legal entities called LLCs, limited liability corporations. Laureen Powell Jobs would be an example. There are others who don't come to mind because it's 4:30 in the morning or 4:50 in the morning here, and I'm not operating in top form. But these LLCs essentially have no disclosure Mackenzie Bezos is another one who's operating through a donor-advised fund. We don't have to get into all the technicalities, but essentially, even the minimal requirements laid upon foundations don't apply to those two philanthropists, just to pick two, multi-billionaire examples. And if we layer more regulations onto the foundation world, you'll simply incentivize people to avoid the foundation structure entirely. So I don't have a good answer as to how to hold this billionaire power accountable, other than, to a degree, the media, Congress could certainly do much better in terms of asking questions of these folks. There have been congressional hearings over the decades on philanthropy that had some impact, but there's no easy answer here.
No, there's not. I mean, there's not an easy answer. I think we do need to, governments do need to start looking at that accountability and transparency, whether it's in foundations, particularly when we are so generous, as you say, Mark, with our tax relief and to those organisations. And I don't know whether it would, if it's all about tax evasion, then maybe you will see LLCs starting up. But quite often it's not necessarily about that. And I think we can achieve greater accountability, but it does require legislation. And then, who in the Capitol is going to put their hand up to say Mike Bloomberg, needs greater accountability and greater controls. Right now, I don't think there'd be a single politician in the Capitol who would do that.
All right, I'm going to go out to, we've got a couple of questions in from outside, but I want a question or two from, I'm going to stand up so I can see people, question or two from in the room. Please keep the questions brief and to the point, and if you've got a point to make it briefly, or make it in the form of a question. Okay, I think it's Amanda, is that? Yeah, okay, Amanda, Wheeler, then John, then there's one over there.
Thank you, Amanda Wheeler. Mark, thank you for your talk. It was really excellent. Mark mentioned in his talk that one thing that struck him was that on this particular issue, the philanthropy was successful in a much shorter amount of time than other issues. I think the example he used was climate change. And I wanted to ask why in particular they were able to be so successful on this issue where, billionaire philanthropy has taken longer and yielded less results on other topics.
Well, can you hear me okay, by the way, Clive?
Yeah, we can hear you. Well, I can. Everyone else here? I can. Yeah. Okay.
Well, climate is a much tougher issue. There are a lot of reasons. Education is another area where U.S. philanthropy has generally been pretty ineffective. I think the reason it has worked so well here is because Bloomberg, Matt Myers, essentially got the entire U.S. health establishment to walk in lockstep in a very short period of time around the issue of vaping. It was also Truth Initiative, it was the Heart Association, it was the Lung Association, it was the Cancer Society. And the timing, unfortunately, fell into place beautifully for the anti-vaping crowd, because right at the time Bloomberg pushed his money out, you had the rise of Juul, you did have significant increase in teen vaping numbers. You then had the EVALI crisis, I put that in quotes because it wasn't really a crisis and there was a lot of misinformation around that. And those combinations laid the groundwork for a very effective campaign. I think, to me, I guess I see two areas where there might be room for some pushback. One is I am really struck by the class elements to the conversation in the US. Essentially, the smoker is sort of forgotten in all of this. The smoker tends to come from lower socioeconomic groups. As I said in my talk, those of us who are well educated or live in nice suburbs, as I do, rarely see smokers. So there's clearly a class element, and that's why, in a way, it's sort of shocking how the Democratic Party in the US has completely dropped the ball on this issue. And I think the other reason for the success, and this, Clive, you've written about this very, very well, is this kind of mindless, hatred might be too strong a word, but antipathy towards the tobacco industry. And everyone keeps pushing that button. I think it accounts for why there's been such unanimity among the health groups on the issue. But as a business reporter, it makes no sense to me. The tobacco industry is doing what it does, which is satisfying a consumer demand for a legal product. And if they want to move into the world of vaping rather than feeling threatened by that, it would seem to me that the appropriate response would be the same as if, an oil company starts building a bunch of, solar panels, which is thank you for moving from a product that does some damage to a product that can do some good. But those are the two reasons that I think it's been successful. They were on the right side of a class issue, and they pushed the buttons on tobacco.
Can I just, it's an interesting premise in Amanda's question about what success is. What they've been successful at is passing legislation. They haven't been successful at all at what the outcome is supposed to be, which is supposed to be, reduced risk, reduced disease, better health, public health. They've got no public health outcomes to show whatsoever for any of that money anywhere. What they have is laws passed, and once the laws are passed, they consider their jobs done. They're not interested in following up on what the effect has been, and actually when people do follow up and find that there have been unintended consequences, they really don't like it. So I think we have to be careful about crediting them with success when actually they've been successful at something that is intermediate to the actual ostensible goals of the program. Fiona, comment?
I think just going back to, I think Mark's second point, which I think is the stronger one, is that it's really easy when you can find an enemy. And climate change, it's a lot harder to have the enemy, where in this one it was very simple to paint the enemy of big tobacco and that, and to win the hearts and minds of legislators on that. No legislator wants to be on the side of big tobacco, or very few feel comfortable there. So I think that was a simple, and it's a great strategy. Find a good enemy and put them up, and then that makes for an almost simple and straightforward campaign.
Right. I'm going to, before we go to John, I'm going to take one from online, and let's get some quick answers in. So we've got a lot of questions building up. How should we approach the World Health Organization, considering they're funded by governments, but also by these? Actually, it's a large number of voluntary contributions from foundations, pharmaceutical companies, or other sort of interest groups. What is the right approach to World Health Organization? Mark, do you want to start, and then Fiona? Yeah. Let's have some quick.
Let me punt that one back to you and Fiona, because that's really outside of my area of expertise.
Look, I don't know that. I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but I think it is quite right that governments fund the World Health Organization. I think it's quite right that we do that. So I wonder whether one of the solutions to this is actually feeding that money that pharmacy companies or foundations actually that goes via governments rather than going direct to the World Health Organization, and that might somehow dilute the influence that those organizations can have on the World Health Organization.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think as advocates or anybody concerned about public health, you should always look at what the democratic pathway is to accountability here and try to, electrify that in some way. So the democratic pathway is through a national government, which is a member and shareholder, essentially, of the WHO, and the member state governments make the decisions via the World Health Assembly. So that is actually the democratic accountability route for WHO. And if WHO, and it's difficult to use it, but if WHO is misusing voluntary contributions or is handling these conflicts of interest badly, that's the pathway to activate, I think. John?
John Oyston from Toronto. Thank you, Mark, for your presentation and for the work that you've done. I really support everything that you've said. When I was a student, I had a friend who was very socialist in her political leanings, and she said that all charity was completely wrong. In her belief, people who make lots of money should be taxed very heavily, and then that money should be given to the government, and the government should do what's necessary for the good of humanity. And at the time, I thought she was completely wrong. That struck me as being very much communism. But I was blown away by what she said, and I've thought about it for the rest of my life. Now we have this example of what unbridled capitalism can do, when somebody can make so many billions of dollars that they can give away $1 billion without even thinking about it. And I'm beginning to think maybe she's right. Maybe this sort of situation where you can make that amount of money and then use that money for whatever suits your whims isn't the way we should be going.
Any thoughts on billionaire capitalists spending their money on good causes rather than super yachts?
Well, I think as long as they pay their tax, which they don't, and that's, to me, it's that massive tax evasion of these large multinationals that I think brings that into question, and also by siphoning it through foundations, by siphoning it through so-called not-for-profits, that they evade tax and they diminish the universal health care, they diminish universal public education by avoiding those taxes. So not so much get rid of charity, but certainly charity after they've paid their fair share of tax.
Any thoughts on that? What happens when they've paid tax and they've still got money to spend? Legitimate or not, Mark?
I mean, the problem I have is that I don't think government has covered itself in glory, at least on this particular issue and on many others. So I don't know that higher, on this issue anyway, I don't know that higher taxation would have done anything other than send more money to the government agencies that have also done a very poor job of communication around public health when it comes to vaping and smoking.
All right, now there was somebody over there earlier, but this gentleman here, and then Derek, I think you want to say something, so go there. Nice short question, nice short answers, please.
Yeah, I'm Jagannath from India. I think what we are doing wrong is painting everyone who's doing philanthropic work with one paintbrush because we have one bad apple. In countries like India, we have problems of plenty. Okay, we have healthcare issues, we do have education, and the government itself is very young. We are only 75 years old, and so we really can't do so much on just the government's team. Even if they had all the money, they don't have those resources. So when you look at philanthropists who are contributing towards such causes, they are actually doing a hell of a lot of good. So there should be a regulatory mechanism, yes, but can we start differentiating and saying, I will allow you in this segment and not in that? That might prove to be a problem, including the Catholic Church. They are setting up schools and they are giving out free education. The quality of education, at least it's education, rather than not having any, right? So that's one of the things that I think should be thought about.
So we're coming to a more, in that view anyway, a more conditional acceptance of philanthropy. What's the governance like? What areas are they working on? How political is it? Maybe the activity and legitimacy of philanthropists should be circumscribed by, to some extent, how they hold themselves accountable and the nature of the issues on which they work. That's what I took from that. Shall we get, hang on, Derek's been waiting, then there's a bunch over here, so let's get some more quick ones in. Let's have Derek, then Ben in a minute.
Thanks, Mark, excellent, and I do associate with the last set of comments, and I even apply them to Bloomberg himself, having seen the incredible good that he's done in so many spheres, and constantly wanting to know why does it not apply to this area. My question, Mark, is, you know the story as a leading journalist about the tree falling in the forest, and here there are trees falling in the forest. Why is it that this story, your story, about a leading philanthropist actually has not broken through into the media, and it's just us talking about it alone.
Okay. Mark, why does no one read your work?
Except for the people in the room, yeah. That's a great question, and I honestly don't know that I have a good answer other than, although I don't think the policy questions are complicated, in other words, how we deal with this issue of vaping and smoking, the science is pretty complicated. There's a lot of misunderstanding about nicotine, even among medical professionals, as we've seen from some polls. And it takes a lot of time to dig in and figure it out. But, you know, it would seem to me that something like the, it wasn't really a paper so much as an essay by the presidents of the Society for the Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, where you have these 15 quite distinguished scientists saying, you know, we're getting this all wrong fundamentally. Why that didn't punch through, I don't know. Now, I'll make a small excuse for my colleagues in the world of media, which is COVID. So essentially, the reporters who know something about health science and public health have had another story to cover for the last 2 years. And it's possible, at least, if the COVID story ever fades or goes away, that this might rise up and get more attention. But yeah, I really find the coverage of this in places like the New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal, to be pretty disappointing.
I do wish the mainstream media paid more attention to science, and the mainstream media doesn't, you know, is you know, really is lacking in covering, I think, not necessarily Mark's work, but as Mark was saying, the work of those scientists, the work of those heads of schools, like that should be a big story, and that should then complement the work that Mark's doing.
All right, I'm going to go to Michelle, please, quickly, Michelle Minton. Quick question,
Very briefly,
Michelle.
on the same thing, on the same vein, you seem to be the only reporter covering Bloomberg's global work, global crusade with tobacco control, and I'm very curious as to what the response has been, besides the Campaign for Tobacco for Kids response to your work, but even within your own organization among your colleagues. Because I noticed you do some writing on this issue at the Chronicles of Philanthropy, but also you post on Medium. Which I'm wondering if that's because the Chronicles doesn't have the space or isn't interested in such in-depth reporting on the topic.
Okay, Mark, quick response on that.
The response has mostly been, again, from people in this room and on Twitter who are interested in issues of harm reduction. Otherwise, the numbers are actually good on these stories in terms of readership, but no, I don't. It doesn't seem to punch through to others.
All right, two over here. Gentleman first, and then Cecilia.
Just came through my head is both the intent and the accountability, and where we sort of think about both those things, and how do we strengthen the intent, the accountability without maybe perhaps jeopardising some of the philanthropic intent behind it, rather than political intent. And getting back to a point that was made earlier, having worked both in the public sector and in philanthropic and charity sector, I've seen much more innovation in civil society than I've ever seen in the public sector. So I would worry too much about not reinforcing that or rewarding that or ensuring that sustains.
So this is a view that's kind of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, basically. There are good things here to be kept, captured, cherished, and then there are bad things, perhaps to do with accountability and political nature of the enterprise, to be challenged much more fiercely. I'm going to take that as a point rather than a question, so we can get another one in. Cecilia?
Hi, Cecilia from Switch Match. I'm pretty sure that we would have another discussion if Bloomberg had been on our side. It would have been happy glory. But I think the main question is really, why is the universe of foundations against tobacco harm reduction? I can understand that they're against the industry, but it appears that they don't really care about the smokers, really.
So that's an interesting question. First of all, are we all just a bit upset because they're promoting things we don't like? And is that just us being a bit biased? But I think that the deeper question is what's really driving this. And it's one of the questions I have is, what's the kind of motivation of someone like Michael Bloomberg? What does he think he's doing? What's he in this? He's clearly not in it for money, because I think, according to my notes, he's got $86 billion. So, you know, a few billion more is not going to make any difference. So what's driving these people, and how big does the spectre of the tobacco industry and maybe their own role as sort of heroic defenders of youth against the predatory evils of big tobacco, is that how they see themselves? Is that what's really driving this?
I think, going back to the point that not everyone, but probably in Bloomberg's case, it is his enormous ego. That he, you know, that if he can beat big tobacco, then, you know, that actually gives him even a faster. Well, he may never die, I don't know, but according to him, when he does, he's got the first class, business class, fast track into heaven. So, you know, is this just shoring that up? But no, I think it's. Sorry, I think it's really got to do with his ego, and you know, we see many other organisations that do good things and are accountable and do question and change, if you know, and are agile. And I think civil society is a good example, because civil society can be more agile. That when something isn't working, they actually change and evolve as a result of that, and that's why we get innovation.
All right, we have a question here. I'm going to jump in, which is basically Bloomberg doing this for the money because he's got conflicting interests? I'm going to take that one. No, definitely not. He's got so much money, more than any of us can even imagine having. That is not what it's about. Prestige, how he feels about himself, his image, his sense of playing a heroic role, rising above the fray of financial services information, which is where he made his money, into much grander themes. It's about the man's prestige, and I'm sure of that. That's how these guys think. Mark's nodding, so
if
that's
he can't
good.
be president.
He can't be president because he made a complete pig's ear of that. Certainly now he's going to be too old. So that's the next best thing, is to be ambassadors and emissaries and all of that kind of stuff. Bent had a question. He's been very persistent and over several minutes. So let the man have a microphone. Yeah, pass the mic. Yeah. Nice short question, Ben, because we're running the last couple of minutes.
Yep, short question to Mark. Can we draw any conclusions of what the Bloomberg Foundation avoids, which is, for example, the Swedish experience of snus? Swedish experience has taken Sweden down to the WHO endgame target, no smoking.
All right. Let's just paraphrase that question, because how does Bloomberg, or should a foundation, deal with contrarian evidence? Evidence that sort of defeats the underlying rationale for their giving, defeats their policy assumptions or whatever. Everybody can get things wrong, but how would a well-run foundation deal with incoming evidence from Bent about the Swedish experience, or data from San Francisco that says that smoking increased when vaping was banned, or whatever? What should happen inside a foundation when that happens?
I mean, I think the answer is obvious. The doors should be open to critics. It's just not the way foundations work. And again, there are others who are even less accountable than Bloomberg. I mean, you know, Laureen Powell-Jobs will not even release a list of groups that she gives money to, and I'm familiar with one or two of those groups, and she's asked them not even to say that she's financing them. So, you know, no transparency. I think maybe one thing to think about, and I know people I've interviewed have thought about this, is finding credible, independent foundations and billionaires, making the case to them, and at least creating some debate in the world about these issues. I mean, I know that was part of the goal of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, but I'm thinking of, going to an existing foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, or the Arnold Foundation, which is very evidence-based, or the Open Philanthropy Project, which is part of the effective altruism movement, a lot of Facebook money there, and saying, no one is paying attention to smokers. We have a solution. Look at what happened in Sweden. Something quite analogous could happen in the US. Let's get a real debate and discussion going around these issues. Because that's what's really been lacking, is effective communication on the harm reduction side.
All right, I know there's a few more questions, but I'm afraid we're actually out of time. I'm really sorry, folks. What I'd like to do is ask both Mark, our keynote, and Fiona, our respondent, just to have one final reflective, that was a good reflective thought from Mark at the end there, but what should be done? Who should do what? What's the right way to address this now? If you're giving advice to people in this room, what should they do? Fiona, you go first, because Mark's thinking. I can see. He's got his thinking face on. And it's 4 in the morning, so.
Look, again, while Bloomberg is terribly powerful, we as electors, I'm a politician, but I still vote. You as voters are very important to our elected officials. You are how they get to be elected officials. So I think continuing the pressure on our elected officials, continuing to present that evidence, it will get through to some. Yeah. It will get through to some. And I think, I think Mark was finishing on that positive note that maybe this campaign against vaping and tobacco harm reduction is starting to peter out. But we need to keep the pressure on. We need to keep the pressure on our elected officials in all of our countries. And and we can do that just as well as Bloomberg, maybe not with the tens of millions of dollars, but at the ballot box and proving to our elected officials that this is a voting issue.
Excellent, great advice. Activate the democratic pathways. Mark, final word from you.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually an issue that's going to be front of mind for voters. So I think the way to proceed is somehow get the science in front of the key elite opinion makers, whether that is board members of Bloomberg, if there are any connections there, board members at other foundations, key legislators and staff in Congress, but somehow find the time to sit down with those people or write to those people and get the science in front of them.
Excellent, great. Okay, we're going to wind up there, folks. That's the end of this session. Could you please give a big hand for Mark and Fiona, and also for yourselves for great questions. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Mission Control.
Thanks, Clive.